Well, a sacred reading of Hazrat Pir Moshe Dinat Khan, of course, dear fellow Murids of Moshe Dinat Khan. As you remember, yesterday we had a reading from the 6th volume of the 1960s Bonnet edition, which was on the inner life and self-realization. Now, in the same volume, somewhat further, you find that Moshe elaborating on that same theme in a lecture called Stages on the Path of Self-Realization. We see that in the words of philosophers, mystics, sages, thinkers and prophets, that great importance is given to self-realization. If I were to explain what self-realization is, I would say that the first step to self-realization is God realization. The one who realizes God in the end realizes self. But the one who realizes self never realizes God. And that is the difficulty today with those who search after spiritual truth intellectually. They read many books about occultism, esotericism, and mysticism. And what they find most emphasized is self-realization. And then they think that what they have to do is to attain that self-realization, and that they can just as well omit God. But in reality, God is the key to spiritual perfection. God is the stepping stone to self-realization. God is the way which extends over the knowledge of the whole of creation. And if God is omitted, then nothing can be reached. There is a wrong method in use today in many so-called cults, which often prove to be a failure, and which consists in teaching the beginner on the spiritual path to say, I am God. A thoughtless phrase, a word of insolence, a thought which has no foundation. It leads him nowhere except to ignorance. To the prophets and thinkers, to the sages who taught their followers the ideal of God, it had a meaning, it had a purpose. But today people do not recognize these. And being anxious to find a shortcut, they omit the principal thing in order to come to the realization of self. Once a man went to a Chinese sage and said to him, I want to learn the occult laws. Will you teach me? The sage said, you have come here to ask me to teach you something. But we have so many missionaries in China who came to teach us. The man said, we know about God, but I've come to ask you about the occult laws. The sage said, if you know about God, you don't need to know anything more. God is all that is to be known. If you know him, you know all. In this world of commercialism, there is a tendency, an unconscious tendency, even for a person who wants to promote the spiritual truth, to cater to the taste of people, either because of a commercial instinct or with the desire to have success. There is a tendency to cater for what people want. If people seem to be tired of the God ideal, those who have that tendency want to give them occultism. They call it that, or mysticism, because the God ideal seems so simple. And as there is a fashion in everything, there is even a fashion in belief. Man thinks that the ideal of God is old-fashioned, something of the past. In order to create a new fashion, he abandons the method, which was the royal road trodden by all the wise and thoughtful of all ages, the method which will surely take man to perfection. Safety and security, safety and success are sure in that path. There may be a man of devotion and of simple faith, religious and believing in God, who calls him the judge or the creator, the sustainer, the protector, the master of the last day, the Lord, the forgiver, and so on. And there may be another man, perhaps an intellectual who has studied philosophy, and he says, God is all, and all is God. God is abstract, and it is the abstract which is God. In point of fact, one has a God, even if only in his imagination, but the other has none. He has only the abstract. He calls it God because the others say God, but in his mind, he has only the abstract. For instance, when you say space, there is no personality attached to it, no intelligence recognized in it, no form, no distinct individuality or personality. And it's the same thing with time. When you speak about time, you do not imagine time to be something or somebody. You say it is time, which means a conception which you have made for your convenience. A man who says that the abstract is God has no God. By this, I do not mean to say that the one or the other is right. What I wish to explain is that from a mental point of view, the one has a God, even if it is only a God of his imagination, but the other has none, whether he admits it or not. Both are right, and both are wrong. One is at the beginning, the other is at the end. The one who begins with the end will end at the beginning. And the one who begins with the beginning will end at the end. Now we might think, why in this short life should we create for ourselves a kind of illusion? Why should we only arrive at truth at the end? Why not begin with it? Why not begin with it? But if truth were such that it could be spoken in words, I would have been the first to give it to you. Truth is a thing that must be discovered. We have to prepare ourselves to realize it. And it is that preparation which is called religion or occultism or mysticism. Whatever we may call it, it is that preparation. We prepare ourselves by one way or the other in order to realize truth in the end. And the best way, which all the thinkers and sages have adopted, is the way of God. The next question is belief in God. There are 4 stages of belief in God. Each stage is as essential and important as the other. And if one does not go stage by stage, gradually evolving towards the realization of God, one does not arrive at anything. It must be remembered that belief is one step on the ladder. Belief is the means and not the end. It leads to realization. It is not that we advance towards a belief. If a man's foot is nailed on the ladder, that is not the object. The object is that he should climb upwards on the ladder, step by step. If he stands still on the ladder, he defeats the object for which he journeys on the spiritual path. Those, therefore, who believe in a particular creed, in a religion, in God, in the hereafter, in the soul, in a certain dogma, are no doubt blessed by their belief and think they have something. But if they remain there, then there will be no progress. If the only thing necessary was to have a religious belief, then thousands and millions of people in the world today who have a certain religious belief could have been the most advanced of people. But they are not. They go on year after year believing something that people have believed in for many generations. And still they continue with it and remain there, just like a man standing on a staircase, which is not a place made for him to stand on, but to climb up. When he stays there, he comes to nothing. The first belief is mass belief. If someone says there is a God, then everyone repeats after him, yes, there is a God. One might think that today, at this stage of civilization, people are too advanced to have mass beliefs, but that is a great mistake. People are the same today as they were 1,000 years ago, perhaps worse if it comes to spiritual questions. Someone who is called the man of the day in a nation is, for the time being, supported by that whole nation. Thousands and millions lift him up, hold him high. But for how long? Until some still more powerful person says, no, it is not so. Then the whole country lets him down. Just before the war, I was visiting Russia. In every shop, one saw a picture of the Tsar and the Tsaritsa held in high esteem. It was a sacred thing for the people. There was a religious ideal attached to the emperor, as he was the head of the church. And they used to be filled with joy when they saw the Tsar and the Tsaritsa passing in the street. It was a religious upliftment for them. But not long afterwards, they themselves had processions in the streets, when at each step they broke the Tsarist emblems. It did not take them one moment to change their belief. Why? Because it was a mass belief. It was a mass belief. It is a very powerful belief. It changes nations, it throws them down and raises them up, it brings war. But what is it after all? A mad belief. And yet, no one will admit it. If you ask an individual, he says, I am not one of them. Yet, at the same time, all move together when impulse comes either for good or bad. Then there is a second step towards belief, and that is belief in an authority, as with people at the time of a dictatorship. They believe in a leader. They say, I will not believe in the ordinary man, in my neighbor, in my colleague. I believe in that man whom I trust. This belief is one step higher because it is a belief in somebody in whom one has trust. When a person says, I am a Christian, it means a belief in Jesus Christ and his teaching. It is a belief in someone. It is not an abstraction. One might think that people do not believe in authority today, but this is not so. For instance, everyone accepts a discovery made by a scientist before even having made investigations about it. Investigations come afterwards. When somebody comes forward and says he has discovered something, everyone accepts it. Perhaps another scientist will produce something else, which one may believe. But the one who says a thing with authority is believed by the multitude. Then there is a third stage of belief, a further stage, and this belief makes man still greater. It is the belief of reason, and it means that one does not believe in any authority or in what everybody else believes, but that one has reasoned it out, that one sees reason in it. This belief is stronger still. For of the beliefs I have explained before, one cannot give proof. But in this case, one can stand up and say, yes, I have reasoned it out. This, however, also has its limitation. Since reason is the slave of the mind, reason is as changeable as is the weather. Reason obeys our impressions. If we have an impulse to insult a person or to fight with him, we can produce many reasons for it. It may be that afterwards there will be contrary reasons. But at the time, when we have this impulse, right or wrong, there's always a reason which supports it. Have the criminals put in jail committed crimes without reason? No, they have a reason too. It does not fit in with the law, perhaps. It does not satisfy society. But if we ask them, they have a reason. The reason we have today, we may perhaps change next week. But nevertheless, this third belief makes us stand on our own feet. For that moment, if not always. For that moment, if not for always. And it gives us a greater power to defend our belief. And then again, there is a fourth belief. That belief is a belief of conviction, which stands above reason. There is a sense of conviction in man, which is not discovered for some time in life. But there comes a time when it is discovered, and that is a blessed day. Then there arises an idea which no reason can break, a feeling which is not a passing feeling, but is a conviction. However high the idea may be, one seems to be the eyewitness of that idea. One is as strong as confident as a person who has seen it with his own eyes. One can be convinced of ideas so subtle that they cannot even be expressed in words. And one is more convinced of them than if one had seen them with one's own eyes. It is this belief which is called by the Sufis and Persian mystics Iman, which means conviction. I remember the blessing of my spiritual teacher, my murshid, which he used to give me every time I parted from him. And that blessing was, may your Iman be strengthened. At that time, I had not thought about the word Iman. On the contrary, I thought as a young man, is my faith so weak that my teacher requires it to be stronger? I would have preferred it if he had said, may you become illuminated, or may your powers be great, or may your influence spread, or may you rise higher and higher, or become perfect. But this simple thing, may your faith be strengthened, what did it mean? I did not criticize, but I pondered and pondered upon the subject. And in the end, I came to realize that no blessing is more valuable and more important than this. For every blessing is attached to a conviction. Where there is no conviction, there is nothing. The secret of healing, the mystery of evolving, the power of all attainments, and the way to spiritual realization all come from the strengthening of that belief, which is a conviction, so that nothing can ever change it. And now we come again to the question of God, because this is the important question we must first make clear in our minds before we can take a further step in spiritual progress. Since to analyze God means to dethrone God, the less said on the subject, the better. But at the same time, the seekers for truth, who want to tread the spiritual path with open eyes and whose intellect is hungering for knowledge, something should be said about it. There is a story in Jalaluddin Rumi's Masnavi that once Moses was walking near the bank of a river and he saw a shepherd boy speaking to himself. Moses was interested and halted there to listen to what he was saying. The shepherd boy was saying, "Oh God, I've heard so much of you. You are so beautiful. You are so lovely. You are so kind, that if you ever came to me, I will clothe you with my mantle, and I would guard you night and day. I would protect you from the cruel animals of this forest, and bathe you in this river, and bring you all good things, milk and buttermilk. I will bring you a special bread. I love you so much. I would not let anyone cast his glance upon you. I would be all the time near to you. I love you so much. If only I could see you once, God, I would give all I have." Moses said, "What are you saying?" The boy looked at Moses and trembled and was afraid. "Did I say anything wrong?" he asked. Moses said, "God, the protector of all beings, you think of protecting him, of giving him bread? He gives bread to the whole universe. You say you would bathe him in the river. He is the purest of all pure things. And how can you say that you will guard him, who guards all beings? And the boy trembled. He thought, what a wonderful thing, what a terrible thing I have done. He seemed to be lost. But as Moses went a few steps further, there came a voice. Moses, what did you do? We sent you to bring our friends to us, and now you have separated one. No matter how he thought of us just the same. You should have let him think the way he was thinking about us. You should not have interfered with him. Everyone has his own imagination of God. It is best if everyone is left to his own imagination. In our daily life, we may hate someone, yet the same one is loved by someone else. We may criticize, and the same one is praised by someone else. If this is so, then the conception of everyone is different. The same person is considered by a saint by one, and as Satan by another. The God we know, or we can know, is nothing but our conception, a picture that we have made of God for our own self, for our own use. It is the greatest mistake for anyone to interfere with the conception of God held by another, or to think that another should have the same conception of God as one has oneself. It is impossible. Many different artists have painted the picture of Christ, yet each one is different. And since we allow every artist to have his own conception of Christ, so we should allow every person to have his own conception of God. We need not blame the ancient Chinese and Greeks and Indians who believed in many gods. Many gods is too small a number. In reality, every single person has his own God. Besides, all the different conceptions are really nothing but covers over one God. Let them call God by name, or think of him with whatever imagination they have. It is, after all, the highest ideal. And the ideal of each one is as high as his imagination can make it. Urging upon someone that God is abstract and formless and pure, and that God is nameless, that all things do not help that person to evolve. For the first step on the path of God is to make a conception of God. It is simply to help the seekers after God, that the wise in all ages have sometimes made a small statue and called it a god or a goddess. And they said, here is God, here is a shrine, come there. And the one who was not satisfied with this, and to the one who was not satisfied with this, they said, walk 200 times around the shrine before you enter, then you will be blessed. And when the worshipper got tired, he naturally felt exaltation because he had walked in the path of God. But one might ask, if we leave everyone with his particular imagination or ideal of God, will he then progress and one day come to the realization of the self, which is the highest attainment taught by all teachers of humanity? The answer is yes. There are 3 stages on the way to spiritual perfection. Those who are unaware of the possibility of spiritual perfection are greatly mistaken when they say that man is imperfect and cannot be perfect. They are mistaken for the reason that they have only seen man in man. They have not seen God in man. Christ has said, "Be ye perfect as even your Father in heaven is perfect." This shows that there is the possibility of perfection. It is also true that man cannot be perfect, but man is not man alone. In man, there is also God. Therefore, though man remains imperfect, the God part in man seeks for perfection. That is what the world was created for. Man is here on earth for this one purpose, that he may bring forth that Spirit of God in him, and thus discover his own perfection. The three stages towards this perfection are the following. The first stage is to make God as great and as perfect as your imagination can. It is in order to help man to perfect God in himself that the teachers have given various prayers to God, calling him the judge, the forgiver, the most compassionate, the most faithful, the most beautiful, most loving. All these attributes are our limited conceptions. God is greater than what we can say about him. And when by all these conceptions and by our imaginations, we make God as great as we are able to, it must still be understood that God cannot be made greater than he is. We cannot give God pleasure by making him great, but by making God great, we ourselves arrive at a certain greatness. Our vision widens, our spirit deepens, our ideal reaches higher. We create a greater vision, a wider horizon for our own expansion. We should, therefore, by the way of prayer, by contemplation, by praise, try to make God as great as we can possibly imagine. The truth behind this is that a person who sees good points in others and wants to add what is lacking in others becomes nobler every day. By making others noble, by thinking good of others, he himself becomes nobler and better than those of whom he thinks good. And the one who thinks evil of others in time becomes wicked, for he covers up the good in him and produces thus the vision of evil. Therefore, the first stage and the first duty of every seeker after the truth is to make God as great as possible for his own good, because he is making an ideal within himself. He is building within himself that which will make him great. The second stage is the stage of the heart. The first is of the head. To make God great intellectually, with thought and with imagination, is really like a painter's work. But it is still more important. But still more important than that is the work of the heart. In our everyday life, we see the phenomenon of love. The first lesson that love teaches is, I am not, thou art. The first thing to think of is to erase ourselves from our minds and to think of the one we love. As long as we do not arrive at this idea, so long the word love remains only in the dictionary. Many speak about love, but very few know what it is. Is love a pastime? an amusement, a drama? Is it a performance? The first lesson of love is sacrifice, service, self-effacement. There is a little story of a peasant girl who was passing through a field where a Muslim was offering his prayers. And the law was that no one should pass by a place where somebody was praying. And after a time, this girl returned by the same way. And the man said, "Oh girl, what a terrible thing you have done today." She was shocked and asked, "What did I do?" And he said, "You passed by this way. It is a great sin. I was praying, thinking of God." She said, "Were you thinking of God? I was going to see my young man. I did not see you. How did you see me when you were thinking of God?" To close the eyes for prayer is one thing, and to produce the love of God is another thing. That is the second stage in spiritual realization, where in the thought of God, one begins to lose oneself in the same way that the lover loses the thought of self in the thought of the beloved. And the third stage is different again. In the third stage, the beloved becomes the self, and the self is there no more. For then the self, as we think it to be, no longer remains. The self becomes what it really is, and it is that realization which is called self-realization. These were our Morshan's most inspiring and most profound words. And I could imagine that many of you will feel a need of thinking about them further, as it is this chapter out of volume 6 of the yellow volumes of the 1916 edition. Maybe many of you might have questions or observations to make about this, and you're welcome to do so, of course. I might maybe add to begin with, just to follow that Morshan Natra speaks of perfect and perfection. What you mostly can understood by that is complete, the completeness. For Morshan, perfection is completeness. And these two words Morshan really uses interchangeably. And Morshan here speaks and gives this important word of Iman. Iman, which Morshan here interprets as conviction. And so he tells how in his Morshan, every time he parted from him, said, "May your Iman be strengthened." And Morshan said, it surprised him, you ever heard the story, it surprised him that his own Morshan would have said that again and again. But Iman is really a key word in this whole conception of spiritual development. By the way, our fellow Murid in Russia, Jahangir Davidov, Alexander Davidov, has just produced a short film, just a 4 or 5 minutes film, actually called Iman. And it's a beautiful little film. He gives all kind of beautiful buildings to accompany very impressive dialogue. Only that impressive dialogue, one can enjoy the beauty of the words, but being in Arabic, few of us will probably be able to follow whatever was being related there, except for enjoying the beauty of the words. But that film of Iman, I hope it will gain currency among the Murids, maybe with some translation added to it. But the interesting thing is that I myself had to ask somebody else to tell me what it was all about. So it took some time before I could acknowledge to him this very fine kind of presentation he made. And then the interesting thing is that the story which is being told in that highly flown Arabic is in fact the same story which Moshe tells here, of Musa alayhi salam, as he's called, the prophet Moses, and the meeting of that shepherd boy. And here again, we see that Moshe relates this story of Moses and the shepherd boy as it is the first given in Jalaluddin Rumi's Masnavi. And that is exactly, as far as I've understood, the person who translated this text for me, that is precisely also the story given in this film Iman of the Jahangir Davidov. So, and the interesting thing, however, is that you see very often in Moshe Natran's works that he takes certain fragments of a particular story, which he uses for that particular occasion, for that particular purpose. And he doesn't look to complicate the theme further by adding further elements which might also be added to the teaching. You find that in Rumi, as you know, he writes very extensively. And so very often you have to look out, you don't miss the point by reading all the extensive comments this poet Rumi was in the mass of everything he tells. But in fact, in Rumi, there is a second part of this story. Musa is taken to task by God to say, I've sent you to unite people with me and not to separate them from me. So he hurries back, tries to find that shepherd boy again. And when at last he finds him, he says, well, I have to take back everything I said to you. God has told me that. How could you do this, wanting to separate from a loyal, a believer in me, from me? I sent you to unite people with me and not to separate. But then Rumi says that the shepherd boy says in a very elaborate and highly literary way, of course, as Rumi has the habit to do. He says, well, Musa, the words you spoke to me were like a lashing of a horse. And now the horse of my understanding has jumped over the misunderstanding. I've achieved that understanding of God, which you wanted to give me. So it is such a wonderful thing that in that presentation of Rumi, on the one hand, so to speak, and well, what is called in Hinduism the lila, the play of God, that in both cases, in both ways in which that divine impulse operates. On the one hand, there is this Moses instructed the boy, but on the other hand, precisely that was something that gave a source of inspiration for that boy in order really to achieve a further inspiration of divine reality. That's what's typical for Rumi's work, of course. And the Moshe Natran's work, in a sense, you find the opposite. He uses particular elements of a particular story which are relevant to that particular point he wants to make, and he doesn't elaborate further, having made that point, on completing a story, because the story is not about the story. The story is about what he intends to convey at that moment. And sometimes also, in that way, Murshid has a contrasting views. You know, when you find that in Murshid's work, a particular point is made with singular emphasis, and you see, well, but there are different approaches, different. There's also some contrary element there, because everything has its own contrast carrying with it as well. Well, in almost every case, when you say, well, why does Murshid emphasize this particular point and does not refer to the opposite? He does refer to the opposite, he does, always, but it's only in a different lecture. So there you have to be very keen to be aware that for Murshid, everything has two different aspects, but not like in a modern article of a modern scholar, he would go everything in one lecture or in one chapter. No, but he finds exactly these different elements or coordinated in different lectures. There he could use that particular aspect of the lecture. One thing which I always enjoyed very much is that somewhere when Murshid and his brothers were in Russia, they met one of the well-known composers of Russia, the time Tainiev. I think that's the way you pronounce that name, Tainiev. And they met him and they were deeply impressed by him. They thought him a very gentle person and a very highly sophisticated person, and yet very modest, very gentle. And so they asked him, Murshid asked him what he thought of Debussy's music. As you know, Debussy in those days was very modern, very new kind of, emerging a new kind of musical style. And so, Tainiev, what did he say? He said, I do not understand him. Any other person might have said, well, I do not really care for this kind of music. No, but Tainiev was so modest, great composer himself, great musician himself. But yet he said, I do not understand him. And they were so emotional, so impressed by the gentleness of that answer. What he said in that way, he made clear that that was not his music, but he put it in a beautiful way. Now, I believe it is the Solvency, no, not Solvency, but the Yesterday and Tomorrow, Murshid quotes Tainiev, and there he says, well, Tainiev said really didn't like Debussy's music. And he said, well, it's so difficult for people to acknowledge something which we do not really understand. So interestingly, he gives two different versions. In the book, you would imagine that he, as Murshid puts it there, you would imagine that he did not really much approve of that answer, that it was too one-sided not to like Debussy's music. I'm afraid Murshid himself was not terribly fond of it either. But anyway, he felt that you had to open yourself to that which you do not know and so gain certain understanding. So do not kind of out of hand reject it or anything of the kind. So there he mentions Tainiev in a sense, not quite a negative, but still in a somewhat critical way. But on the other hand, in the stories which he told about Tainiev, they praised him as the most gentle person he could possibly have met. So there you get again these two different aspects of it, which you may find in many different aspects of Murshid's life and biography. I must not take too much time. I think we have another program coming on, but maybe I could still, once on this aspect, there is another thing which strikes me, which is that, Murshid says about his Murshid, may God strengthen your iman. And that brought me back to the understanding, Murshid in Hyderabad was regarded as an extremely modern person, almost a revolutionary person. Why? Because he had done something which he had regularly done in Baroda, sometimes also been criticized by Indian nationalists, and which in Hyderabad, a very conventional city where the old moral culture was very consciously cultivated, was really rather strange. That is, he wore European dress. He wore European dress because his uncle, who had lived in England for a long time, was completely Anglicized, ordered suits for himself, but also for his nephews. And so his nephews got into the habit of wearing this European clothing. And so when Hazrat Inayat Khan came to Hyderabad, already very well known as Professor Inayat Khan Pakhan, a well-known musician and musical scholar, then the Hyderabadis, with their very cultural tradition and wishing to maintain those traditions, looked at him as somewhat, an Anglo, a person who was really Anglicized, and, that was not really some of their kind. And so in older biographies, like in Miriam Bloch's Confessions of Inat Khan, you will find that Murshid Inat Khan tells that in the first place it was another anglicized Hyderabadi, Abdul Majid, who advised him to take on initiation, to become a Sufi. And Inat Khan said, well, he was really very surprised that really didn't occur to him. As you know, Sufism not specifically allied to an order, but allied to the cultural tradition as well as the spiritual tradition, was part of his family legacy. So he was a bit surprised that this Abdul Majid told him, well, it's time for you now to go and search for a teacher, a spiritual teacher. But he did so. And then Murshid tells in the Confessions that quite a few teachers refused to accept him. And other teachers who were willing to accept him were not the kind of teacher that Murshid Inat Khan would accept. So, and why did these people not accept him? Because a person dressed like a European, like an Englishman, was such a Fremdkörper, was such a kind of novel appearance that they felt that was not really quite what it ought to be. And that exactly, then you get the story, and you find it in biography, how Murshid then met his own Murshid, which was in a large gathering of, and where suddenly his Murshid appeared as well. And then the story always goes that Abu Hashim Madani saw Inat Khan, and you know the story, who is this young man, etc. What the Murshid really meant to convey by that is, all right, here we have this young man in this English appearance, but that does not mean to exclude him. He, whatever his appearance, whatever his dress is, but it is something which, as such, I find quite acceptable. Otherwise, people might consider it kind of, improper to use that kind of dress in a meeting of scholars and Sufis, etc. So there is always that. And so when Abu Hashim Madani emphasizes that may God strengthen your iman, it also means, all right, you are, but keep on at the level of iman. Do not, go far in the other direction. Don't also, despite your dress and all that, don't become a completely anglicized Indian. Maintain your own culture. That was part of why that phrase of Iman was so strong and so often repeated. That Murshid, so to speak, embraced these two great traditions of civilization. His dress symbolized his acceptance of Western civilization, and of course, his teaching and his whole culture was Indian. So that again was a point of Abu Hashim to say, maintain your Indian culture, however European or however Western you might become. And Murshid Inat Khan with that wonderful spirit of elevating everything what he heard, everything what he saw, certainly what his Murshid said, elevating it to the highest possible form of understanding. For him, the inspiration of Abu Hashim's words were, of course, that of that level of, which he explains so beautifully, where he says, I would prefer if he had said, may you become illuminated, or may your powers be great, or may your influence spread, or may you rise higher and higher, or become perfect. But this simple thing, may your faith be strengthened. What did it mean? I did not criticize, but I pondered and pondered upon the subject. And in the end, I came to realize that no blessing is more valuable and important than this. For every blessing is attached to a conviction. Where there is no conviction, there is nothing. The secret of healing, the mystery of evolving, the power of all attainments, and the way of spiritual realization all come from the strengthening of that belief, which is a conviction, so that nothing can ever change it. Now you have that wonderful example, for an expression which you might give this kind of, explanation I've given to it. But Murshid Inat Khan raises that to a level of spiritual inspiration and values, and that is typical for all Murshid's work. Murshid takes any kind of simple element and attach it that dimension of development, of the perspective of perfection, of fully living in that. And this is part of his magic. This is part of the extraordinary thing. Also, when you read Gitas, etc., these different, when Moshe speaks about symbols and about habits and customs, etc., he always ennobles all the notions, all the values, because he will never for any way criticize or condemn any of the older values or standards or ideas people had. He will always add that additional psychological and spiritual dimension to it, which gives it all these things, the original meaning, and beyond the original meaning, a kind of spiritual dimension, which gives it an added inspiration for our times. That's one of the aspects of Moshe Nathan's greatness. Sorry, I've talked too much again, and I'm sure these texts are so inspiring that they always tend to diverge. But any of you have any questions or comments which you like to bring up and discuss?
I think there's no questions or no remarks, so maybe we'll have a little silence, just a minute or so, and then ask Ali Ungan and Jabir and Roshan to
Thank you.
There's a little bit. So then we ask them to do the Sufi songs, the Ilahi and the Zikr.
So